Welcome to my YouTube channel, Rick Surowicz Watercolor. At any time during this video, you can click on the icon in the lower right hand corner to subscribe to my channel. This is the narrated step-by-step tutorial for a simple landscape. There was no reference photo used for this painting. It began with just a sketch from my imagination in my sketchbook. It's about 2 inches by 3 inches, so it's a very small sketch just using a black pen. And this was the starting point for my painting. Using my imaginary sketch from my sketchbook, I drew a light pencil sketch on a 8 by 10 inch sheet of watercolor paper. This is a 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. I'm going to begin my painting by wetting the paper in the area above the mountain shapes and the tree lines. So it's the sky that I'm going to put in a wash of clear water to saturate the paper. And I'm cutting this wash around these 2 mountain shapes that I've put in. And once I have the area that I want to work in saturated, I'm going to load my brush up with some cerulean blue, and I'm going to start to paint the sky. So I want to pick up any excess beads of water, and then I'm going to begin to paint. So I'm just dropping in some cerulean blue, and I wanted to suggest a partly cloudy sky. So I'm just using a soft round wash brush. And once again, there's no reference for this. This is all just imagination. I'm going to blot up some of the excess in areas where I want a little bit more of the white to show through. And that's a very quick way to paint a very simple blue, partly cloudy sky. I've thoroughly dried the paper, and now I'm going to start to paint these mountain shapes with just a light wash of a royal blue. I'm going to use some gradation here with my wash. And I'm just envisioning very simple mountain shapes here that has some light hitting on the side. And I'm going to do the same with this larger mountain shape. I really don't want to put a lot of detail in these. I just want to suggest that they're out there, they're in the distance. There's not a lot of dark values, not a lot of contrast, just some blue tones to suggest distance. Soften those edges up a little bit. And now I have that area of paper is saturated where I've painted the mountain. And I'm going to come in working wet and wet. And I'm going to give the suggestion of a tree line there. I've kind of sketched the outline of a tree line. That could be in front of that or some lower hillsides. And I'm going to take some royal blue with a little sap green in it. Give me more of a blue-green tone, and I'm going to work wet and wet in the shape where I painted the mountain. So this is just going to suggest a distant tree line there in front of that mountain. You'll notice that the colors I'm using here in the distance tend to be cool blue tones, blue and blue-greens, and that tends to be how things often are in real life. In the distance, they take on a blue cast, and the edges are a little softer, and that helps suggest distance when you're working with a painting. As I start to move forward, I'm going to start to warm up some of the greens that I'm using. I'll start to move away from that blue-green, and I'm going to start to move more towards a green. So here you can see that there's a stronger presence of green in this mixture that I'm putting down now, and I'm continuing to work wet and wet, and just giving an indication of some closer trees. They could be evergreens, firs, or pine. Remember, I'm not using any reference here, so I'm free to imagine exactly what I'm putting in my landscape. And you'll notice as I put that in, I tried to make the spacing varied. I didn't want everything to look the same. I don't want it to look like a picket fence. I also try to vary the height and the shapes of the trees that I'm putting in. And now I'm going to give the suggestion that I have some trees that are even closer and they're getting warmer. There's a stronger presence of a red tone in this. In this case, I'm using some sap green with some pyrrole red. And fewer trees, spread out a little bit more. So I've really put in 3 layers of trees working wet and wet into this mountain. I want to get a little bit more contrast between a few of these layers here, so I'm actually going to take a damp brush with clear water and I'm going to pick up some of the pigment that I have there, and it's going to lighten the value where I'm removing some of the pigment. It'll lift just a little bit more. So I have a damp brush and you can see it's picking up some of that paint. So this paper right now is still pretty saturated. It's starting to move towards damp paper, but I can lift it with some paint with a damp brush. And to the right there, I am getting a little bit of a backwash because it's introduced a little bit of moisture into damp paper, but it's working the way I want. And now I'm going to come back in with a darker value once again. And even though this is a very dark value, it's still a pretty warm tone. It's leaning towards an earthy, dark earthy green, more so than a blue-green. I just want to give some touches of some of this value to suggest some of these trees kind of disappearing in the mist and the atmosphere taking over there, and you lose visibility of parts of it. I've continued to work in this area with the paper being wet. Sometimes I dry it and build layers on top of it. In this instance, I've been working mostly wet and wet. And now I'm going to start to move over to the side of this area and start to carry the suggestion of these trees to the sides and away from that wet and wet area in front of the mountain. And these are trees that are going to get closer to us in the middle ground and foreground. So you can see these are a fairly dark value green, still leaning towards a warm dark value green. I'm using this quill brush I like to use. It's very expressive. I can make some nice brush strokes with it. And now I'm working wet on dry, because I moved away from that area in the paper where it's saturated. And the same on this side. This is an area that is dry. I might come across a little bit of damp paper there in the mountain, but overall it's a pretty dry area on my paper. So I'm not trying to paint 1,000 leaves on these trees. I'm envisioning it as a big shape and pieces of smaller shapes within it. And I'm going to come back with some darker values here to differentiate these trees from one another a little bit more. And I'm not really painting these trees as individual trees so much as I'm letting them kind of merge together into one shape, but towards the top they start to stand out a little bit as one tree. And I'm letting some of that get lost in what's going on behind it. I want to have some bright tones in my painting. I'm going to come in with some very bright greens. This is a permanent green light paint that I'm using, and just giving some touches of that to some grassy areas that could be on the banks here along this river coming through. And I'm not painting the whole shape that green, just the top. And now I'm going to come in with a little bit of quinacridone gold and work some of that in. And the direction of my brush strokes is important because I'm using those to help suggest the direction and the contours of the landscape here. So some of those brush strokes, by making them horizontal or at an angle, depending on where I'm at, help show what the contour is in that area. Now I've got some royal blue, and I'm working wet on dry, but I'm letting these washes that I'm putting down start to merge together. And the nice thing about this is I'm not worried about trying to make it look like a photograph, because there is no photograph. This place theoretically doesn't exist. So I can have a little bit more fun with it. Here again, the brush strokes and the shapes that I'm painting are important. They help define that shape. And there I started with a little royal blue, and I came in with some quinacridone gold, a little bit of raw sienna. And I just want to get some interlocking shapes here. Just carry some of that value into the white that's there. I'm going to paint these rocks that I've drawn in the river. I'm just going to touch that with some royal blue. Now I'm just trying to make it appear as though there's some ripples in this river as it's coming through. It's going over top some rocks. It could be going over top some pieces of wood. One of the things I think sometimes gets difficult when people are trying to copy photographs is they get so caught up in the copying the photograph and trying to make something look like the photograph. They lose sight of the shapes that are there, and whether it's a tree or a rock or just the contour of the land. Try to make interesting shapes. And if the rock that you're looking at in your photograph isn't really an interesting shape, if it looks like a lump of dirt, then don't paint it that way. Paint it and make it a little bit more interesting. Change the edge a little bit or make it interlock with another shape. But you don't have to paint exactly what you see. You want to have some artistic license and make things look interesting, make the shapes look interesting. I like some of the color transition that's happening here, the bright green into some of the gold tones and the blue tones, that some of them have turned more into a neutral tone. And I'm coming back in here with some more royal blue. I think sometimes people paint rocks, they think all rocks are brown, and they're not really brown. They're all kinds of colors. And I want to insert a bit more excitement in the colors here. I like some of these transitions, but I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to charge some of these areas that I've put a wash down with a nice quinacridone burnt orange. So I'm going to put some touches of that quinacridone burnt orange into some of these areas. So I'm just charging that wash with this color, and you can see how it's diffusing into the areas I've already painted, because my paper is still very saturated. So it gives a nice soft transition. There's gradation happening, there's soft edges happening. And I don't just want that color on one side of my composition. I want to try and distribute it throughout the composition so I get a nice balance. You can see that I have some of these blues working, some of these greens working, these nice burnt orange tones in different areas of the composition. I want to get a little bit more of that green tone in a few spots here. I've thoroughly dried my paper, and now I'm going to put in a few more tree shapes here. Now these are going to be closer to us, and they're going to be harder edged, and they're going to have darker values. And this is one of the ways that you can help establish a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. You don't want all your value dominance being the same in each of those areas. You don't want the same value dominance in your foreground, middle ground, and background. Your composition will be very flat, and it'll be hard to see depth and distance. By balancing that value dominance within the foreground, middle ground, and background, you can help establish that feeling of depth in your painting. So those things in the distance in this painting here are less defined. They tend to have a bluish cast, cooler colors, and they start to feel like they're in the distance. But these trees that I'm painting now are going to be harder edge, darker value, stronger contrast, and they're going to feel closer to us, so you start to get that feeling of depth. I think when you start to realize that the eyes need some place to rest, and you start working on focal points, and everything everywhere in your composition doesn't look the same, you start to make strides in your art, because you don't want to develop the painting the same everywhere. You don't want the same level of detail, the same level of contrast, and the viewer doesn't really know where to look, and everything looks the same, and things tend to get very flat. Sometimes you'll see some very nice colors, very nice values in a landscape or a still life or a floral, but the values are very confusing. It's very hard to see what's close to you, what's far away, what's in a middle ground, and it creates a very flat painting. So be strategic with your value placement, and when I say value placement, I'm talking about value dominance. Make sure you can establish a foreground, middle ground, background using value dominance. So these trees that are closer to us here have harder edges, they have some darker values, and they have some smaller shapes. Some of the distant ones are more one overall shape, while these here have some smaller things going on within the larger shape of the tree. I want to have another kind of a hard edge shape here. Break this up a little bit more back here. I'm just going to let it kind of disappear. Now I'm going to take a liner brush with a dark value mixture that has a little bit of burnt orange in it, a little bit of royal blue, and I'm just going to give an indication of some tree trunks here. I like to bring these in afterwards. Sometimes when you put in a tree trunk and then you put the foliage on, you kind of hang the foliage on this big stick, it looks like, and sometimes people will put those trunks in and make it look like there's no foliage on the side that's facing you when the foliage goes around the entire tree. So I like to come in afterwards and I just put in a broken up tree trunk. And I'm just going to give a suggestion of some old dried out trees here sticking up in my painting. So just a little bit of an indication of some branches coming off those, just to provide a little bit more interest. So I'm doing all this with my liner brush. I've dried my paper. Now I'm going to come in and put in a wash of, I'm using peacock blue, and that's a Holbein color. But you can use a phthalo, you can use any number of blues here. And I'm just going to put a wash where this water is in this river, and I'm going to leave some areas where the white's coming through. And I'm working wet on dry right now. I'm going to strengthen that a little bit. And as that comes forward and closer to the foreground, I'm not going to have as much blue in the water. I'm going to let that start to gradate into a whiter tone to the white of the paper, just to suggest that the water's rushing at us and it's hitting these rocks, and it's there's some rapids there, but we will still have some of this blue touches of it here. And I'm going to soften that a little bit with fine mist spray. I like to do this sometimes with some running water. I just like the effect that it gives. I want to carry some of that blue to the left hand side there, and then soften that and let it run down a little bit. I've dried my paper now, and I'm going to come back over top of the water, and I'm going to glaze over that with a light wash of royal blue. It's a light middle value wash that I'm putting down right now. And I want to have some value change in my water here as I get closer to the shore. I'm going to bring that blue down. And here, as I bring that across, I'm trying to suggest some of those areas where it's running over the rocks. There would be some deeper blue water there. I want to go a bit darker with this, so I'm going to put some touches of a darker mixture of the royal blue, so there's a little bit more pigment in my mixture. And I want to bring even a little darker blue into there. So right now I'm working, I started wet on dry, but then I started to work wet on wet as I've added to the initial glaze that I put down. And I want to bring that value across a little bit, because I want it to, I don't want it to be isolated on the left hand side, so I need to bring some of that to the right. And I want to vary the shapes a little bit. Here I'm going to diffuse a little bit of that blue down, not much, just soften that edge a little bit and make it look like that water's coming over a rock. Thoroughly dried my paper once again, and now I'm coming back with a darker mixture to put on this tree. So this has some sap green, royal blue, and some pyrrole red in it, and even a touch of quinacridone and burnt orange. But it's giving me a nice dark value, and I'm just trying to make some expressive brush strokes on top of what I have there. And I really want that darker values, so that's starting to pull more towards the foreground. So I'm starting here to establish more of a background, middle ground, and foreground. So I have those really distant trees that you can just make out the shapes, and then I start to move forward, and you can start to get a little bit more definition to those trees that are more in the middle ground. And then as we start to get closer to the foreground, we start to see these darker values, these hard edge shapes that I'm putting in right now. So this is where I'm talking about value dominance. and the placement of those and how they can be very important. If I had this value going all the way back in every tree, you wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of which ones were close, which ones are far away, except for maybe the size of them would be a clue. Here I'm trying to put some of that value down into the terrain here, and you can see there's a slope to this, so I'm trying to give the suggestion of that slope as I make some of these brush marks. I'm going to work some darker values into the water area. So I've put about 3 layers of value into the water so far, and now I'm probably working on the 4th layer here, and need to give a little bit more a contrast in this area and bring those dark values down into some of these areas here. I want to have some larger dark valued shapes. Again, I'm coming in here on top of this water and getting much stronger with the wash that I'm putting down. And this particular wash is royal blue with a touch of ultramarine blue in it. And I want to have some larger dark valued shapes on these pieces of land here. So I'm going to take some quinacridone burnt orange, and it has just a little bit of royal blue in it, and I'm going to paint some darker values on these rocks and on the ground here. Still trying to keep them as interesting shapes and interesting brush marks as I make them. You notice that a lot of times I'll just make a brush mark and I'll leave it. I try and keep it fresh and expressive. I don't tend to outline shapes and fill them in with a brush like a paint by number approach. I like to make expressive brush strokes, put them down, leave them, and move on. Still want to bring some of that value across to the right side of my composition. Everything tends to be leaning on the left here, and these areas on the right in space are about the same place in terms of foreground, middle ground, background. I want to put a few more touches of value in some places. There's a point in my painting process where I start to make some small colorographic marks or lines, just dots, dashes, little small shapes. And normally when I'm putting them in, I'm trying to help distribute a value or a color, or I'm trying to help define an edge, or bring a little bit more attention to an area. But I normally have a reason for making that brush stroke. I always tell people that if you don't know why you're taking your brush to the paper, you probably shouldn't be doing it. Make sure you have a reason when you make a brush mark. I want a little bit more activity in a few of these areas, and one of those areas I want to get a little bit more going on in the water. I want to put some smaller dark valued shapes in here. I'm trying to bring those across in a horizontal manner there, so it suggests that that water is running over a rock or a fallen branch or something. So these are combinations of line and just colorographic marks that I'm making. I generally don't outline things. I try to break up continuous lines. I normally don't have real long lines without having a break in it somewhere, and I let the viewer complete that. When they look at it, their eye will complete some of those broken lines. So I don't just, I try to avoid just outlining things. I think it would be interesting to have some linear marks in here, some grassy shapes, some branches and twigs sticking up. So I'm going to take my liner brush and I'm going to make some marks here with some dark value. And sometimes I'll say dark value and somebody says, I wish you would tell me what color it is. It really, at this point, I'm not that concerned with it. It could be a dark blue, it could be a dark orange or brown. It could be a combination of warm and cool tones. What's important is the value. And here I'm just making some, like I said, some branches and grass and things sticking up and growing over. It helps break up some of the edges, and it helps create overlap. And overlap is something that helps build depth into a composition. I want to bring in a little bit more dark middle value blue here to take that blue all the way across this river here in this area. I just felt it seems a little too open on the right side, so I want to close that off a little bit and connect it a little bit more to the other side. And just a few more touches here and I think we'll be done. I'm going to put a mat on this so we can get a good look at it without the tape and without the board. And there we have our simple landscape. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more videos or you want to subscribe, be sure to click on one of the boxes that's appearing on the screen.